The door to my husband's office was ajar. That was the first thing that was wrong. I was about to call out to him, to ask if he preferred roses or peonies for the engagement party, but the words died in my throat. Through the crack, I saw him, my husband of 30 years, Richard, and in his arms was Amber, the beautiful, sweet girl my son, Leo, was about to marry. They were kissing. A deep, lingering kiss that spoke of history, not a recent mistake. The air was punched from my lungs, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a gasp. But as I stood there, frozen, my heart shattering into a million pieces, my eyes locked on something else. It wasn't the affair that made the world stop. It was the glint of silver at Amber's throat. A locket, a very specific, antique silver locket that I hadn't seen in 20 years, a locket I knew belonged to a dead woman. My name is Eleanor, and in that single, horrifying moment, my life split into two distinct parts. The warm, comfortable illusion I had lived in for 3 decades, and the cold, terrifying reality that had just been revealed. The woman wearing that locket wasn't just some girl having an affair with an older man. She was a ghost from a past I thought was long buried. This is the story of how I found out that the foundation of my entire life wasn't just a lie, but a crime. It's about how I discovered the man I slept next to and the woman my son loved were partners in a cruel plot to destroy me. They thought I was just a quiet, unsuspecting wife. They were wrong. This story is a difficult one to tell, and I know I'll need a friend along the way. To make sure you hear how I turned their own plan against them, you can follow my journey here. That way, you won't miss a single part of the truth. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream, or cry, or shatter a vase against the wall, even though every cell in my body wanted to. Instead, I did the strangest thing. I backed away from the office door, one silent step at a time, my stocking feet making no sound on the cold marble floor. The house, my beautiful, sun-drenched home, suddenly felt like a stranger's museum full of precious things that had no meaning. All I could hear was the frantic drumming of my own heart, a sound so loud I was sure they'd hear it through the closed door. I grabbed my car keys from the bowl by the entrance, my hand shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to pick them up. I had to get out. I had to breathe air that wasn't poisoned by their lies. I drove for an hour, aimlessly, the pristine suburban streets blurring into a watercolor of green and gray. The image of that locket was burned into my mind. I knew it like I knew my own name. It had belonged to Elena Petrov, the wife of Richard's then best friend and business partner, Dmitri. 20 years ago, Richard had come home, his face a mask of grief, to tell me Dmitri had taken his own life. He'd made a series of disastrous investments, Richard explained, and had lost everything. He'd been too proud to accept help. Elena and their little girl, who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, had disappeared back to Europe to live with family shortly after. I never saw them again. My heart had broken for them. Now, that same locket was around the neck of the girl about to marry my son. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. That evening, when Richard came into the living room, I decided to test the waters. I couldn't ask about the kiss. Not yet, that was my secret weapon. But I could ask about the locket. I kept my voice steady, casual, as I looked up from my book. I saw the loveliest necklace on Amber today, I began. An antique silver locket. It reminded me so much of the one Elena Petrov used to wear. Richard's smile didn't falter, but something flickered in his eyes. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift, he chuckled. The sound smooth and practiced. He had the nerve to tell me it was just a coincidence. Eleanor, darling, you know how these styles come back around? He said, waving a dismissive hand. Amber told me her parents left it to her. A family heirloom. You're just connecting dots that aren't there. He patted my shoulder, his touch feeling like a spider crawling on my skin. He told me I was probably just stressed from all the wedding planning. That was his first mistake. Amber had sold Leo a heartbreaking story about being an orphan with no family to speak of. She'd told us she'd grown up in the foster care system with no heirlooms to her name. Richard's story and her story were a direct contradiction. It was a small crack, but it was enough for the light to get in. He was lying. They both were. That night, after he fell asleep, his steady breathing a rhythm of deceit beside me, I tiptoed down to the basement. I dug through dusty boxes of old photo albums, my hands covered in the grime of buried memories. I was looking for proof that I wasn't going crazy. And I found it. A photo from a company holiday party dated 1999. There was Richard, young and ambitious, with his arm around Dmitri, and next to Dmitri was his beautiful wife, Elena. And around her neck, gleaming under the camera flash, was the locket. But that wasn't the real discovery. Tucked behind the photo was a thin, folded piece of paper I'd used as a placeholder and forgotten about. It was a bank statement, my bank statement, from the week after Dmitri's death. I never paid much attention to our finances. Rich had handled everything, but I recognized the date. And on it, there was an incoming wire transfer for $50,000 from an offshore account I'd never heard of. The memo line had only 2 words: consulting fee. $50,000. A fortune back then. It was paid to me, not Richard, just days after his best friend, his brother, had supposedly lost everything and ended his life. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a condolence gift. It felt like a payment. It felt like hush money. That was the moment the grief turned to ice in my veins. The affair was a symptom. The real disease was a secret Richard had been keeping for 20 years. A secret that had just walked into our lives wearing my son's engagement ring. I sat on the dusty floor of my basement until dawn, the old bank statement clutched in my hand. The paper felt brittle, like a relic from a life that was no longer mine. $50,000 funneled through my account. I wasn't just the wife of a liar, I was an unwitting accomplice in his crime. The thought made me sick to my stomach. This single piece of paper was everything, and yet it was nothing. It was too old, too vague. It was my word against Richard's, and Richard was a master of weaving convincing tales. I couldn't go to Leo. Not yet. How could I tell my son that his father was a monster and his fiancée was a phantom? No, I needed more. I needed a professional. Finding Frank Miller felt like stepping into a spy movie. I used a pay-as-you-go phone I bought with cash from a convenience store the towns over. I found his name on a discreet website for private investigators, his bio mentioning 25 years as an FBI agent specializing in financial crimes. It was a perfect fit. We met in a small, noisy diner where no one would recognize me. He was an older man, with eyes that seemed to see right through the polite, frantic facade I was putting on. He didn't say much. He just listened, nodding occasionally as I laid out the whole sordid story of the kiss, the locket, the conflicting histories of Amber being an orphan, Richard's casual lie, and finally, the bank statement. I expected him to be skeptical, but he just looked at the paper with a practiced eye. He told me that, in his experience, the ugliest truths are often hidden in the driest of details. I gave him his instructions. First, find out who Amber really was. I needed her entire history, from birth until the day she met my son. Second, I wanted him to dig into Richard's financial life from 20 years ago. I told him to start with Dmitry Petrov's supposed bankruptcy and see where the money really went. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. I had to play the part of the happy, oblivious wife and mother. I sat through a dinner with Richard, Leo, and Amber. A lump of dread lodged in my throat. I listened as Amber talked excitedly about her wedding dress ideas, her smile never reaching her eyes. I watched Richard watch her, a flicker of something dark and proprietary in his gaze. I had to force myself to eat, to smile, to engage in the meaningless chatter. It was a terrifying game of masks. I wasn't just looking at my husband and my future daughter-in-law anymore. I was looking at 2 strangers with a shared, deadly secret. The clinking of their wine glasses sounded like a countdown timer. The call came on the second day. It was Frank. His voice was low and urgent. He didn't want to talk over the phone. He needed to see me immediately. We met at the same diner. This time, he didn't wait for me to speak. He slid a plain manila envelope across the sticky vinyl tabletop. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first document was a birth certificate. The name on it was Sofia Lena Pet. Date of birth October 12, 1991. Mother's name, Elena. Father's name, Dmitry Petrov. My breath hitched. Amber didn't exist. She was Sophia, the little girl who had vanished after her father's suicide. The story about being an orphan wasn't just a lie to gain sympathy. It was a disguise, a perfect, impenetrable disguise to get inside my home, to get close to my son. But that wasn't the worst of it. Frank pushed a second document out of the envelope. It was a property deed. He explained that he'd found a shell corporation Richard had founded just 1 month before Dmitry's death. That same corporation had purchased the Petrov family home at a foreclosure auction for a fraction of its value. Richard hadn't just stood by while his best friend was ruined. He had orchestrated the ruin, and then he'd picked the bones clean. I stared at the documents, the cheap diner coffee growing cold in my cup. Sophia wasn't an orphan who happened to find my son. She was a daughter who had come to find her father's destroyer, and she had found him in my house, in my husband. I drove home from the diner in a daze, the birth certificate and the property deed feeling like lead weights in my handbag. It was one thing to discover your husband was a cheat and a thief. It was another thing entirely to realize he was a ghoul who had feasted on the carcass of his best friend's life. The man I had loved didn't exist. I had been sleeping next to a monster for 30 years, and now that monster had invited a second one into our home, a ghost he had created, who was now poised to marry my son. My fear, which had been a cold knot in my stomach, now morphed into something sharper, more urgent. This wasn't just about the past anymore. Sophia was not here to reminisce. She was here for a purpose, and the thought of that purpose being connected to my son, my innocent, trusting Leo, was unbearable. What was their endgame? Why this elaborate, cruel charade of a marriage? I called Frank from my burner phone that night. My voice was different now, a longer trembling, but low and steady. I told him the focus of the investigation had changed. I didn't need any more proof about what happened 20 years ago. I needed to know what was going to happen next. I gave him an authorization that made my hands shake as I signed it. I told him to do whatever it took to find out their plan. I knew what I was asking. Surveillance. Bugs. Crossing lines I never dreamed I would cross. But my son's life was on the line. My life was on the line. I was no longer just a victim. I was a combatant in a war I didn't even know had been declared. The days that followed were a masterclass in deception. I helped Leo and Sophia review catering menus. I discussed floral arrangements with a fake smile plastered on my face. At one point, Sophia touched my arm, her expression full of feigned daughterly affection, and told me how lucky she was to be joining our family. I could smell the expensive perfume she wore, the same scent I'd smelled in Richard's office. The urge to recoil was so strong it took all my willpower to simply nod and pat her hand. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught between the placid, beautiful surface of my life and the churning, monstrous reality beneath. The break came 3 days later. Frank called. He told me he had something, an audio file from a listening device he'd managed to place in Richard's home. He warned me that what I was about to hear was disturbing. He sent it to a secure email address he'd set up for me. That night, I waited until the house was completely silent. I took my laptop into the walk-in closet in my master bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor, surrounded by my clothes, my own private confession. I put on my headphones, my heart pounding against my ribs, and I pressed play. I heard their voices, Richard's and Sophia's. At first, they were talking about the wedding, but then the tone shifted. I heard Richard tell her about a durable power of attorney I had signed a few years back. He had told me it was a standard precaution in case of a medical emergency, a simple piece of estate planning, but that's not what they were talking about. I heard him, my husband, calmly explaining how they would use that document, along with a paid-for diagnosis from a private doctor, to have me committed. He was saying they would claim my recent forgetfulness and paranoia were clear signs of early-onset dementia. Then I heard Sophia's voice, colder and clearer than I could have imagined. She was the one driving the plan. She spoke about liquidating my assets once I was institutionalized. For my own care, of course, she said they needed to move quickly after the wedding, before Leo could get suspicious. They were planning to steal my life, my freedom, and my sanity, all under the guise of concern. But that wasn't the worst part. Richard mentioned my portfolio, our joint accounts. And then Sophia, in a voice dripping with contempt, told him he was thinking too small. I heard her tell him about the private art collection my mother had left me. A secret collection I kept in a climate-controlled storage unit, worth at least $1.5 million. A collection Richard knew nothing about. She had investigated me thoroughly. She had uncovered my last, most personal secret. I ripped the headphones from my ears, gasping for air in the darkness of the closet. This was the bottom of the well. They weren't just trying to get what they thought they were owed from Richard. They were going to strip me of everything, including my mother's legacy, and leave me to rot in a high-end asylum, forgotten by the world. The man I'd built a life with, and the girl my son adored, were going to bury me alive. The tears I expected to fall never came. The sadness was gone, burned away by a sudden, white-hot rage. They thought I was a fragile, clueless housewife. They thought I would break. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I walked out of that closet a different woman. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of my stomach, but it was no longer in control. It was fuel. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't see a terrified, heartbroken victim. I saw a stranger, a woman with eyes that were cold and calculating. I saw a general preparing for war. My objective was no longer just to survive, it was to win. And to win, I had to join their game. So, I began to play the part they had written for me. I started small, seeding the narrative they wanted to believe. One morning, I made a show of frantically searching for my car keys, only for Richard to find them hanging on the designated hook by the door. I feigned embarrassment, telling him my mind was like a sieve lately, with all the wedding stress. I saw the look he exchanged with Sophia over the breakfast table, a mixture of pity and satisfaction. It was working. They were so sure of my decline, they were getting comfortable. The perfect stage for my performance came a week later during our weekly family dinner. Leo, my sweet, oblivious son, was talking about their honeymoon plans, his face glowing with love. Richard was playing the part of the proud father, while Sophia was the image of the adoring fiancée. It was a perfect portrait of a lie. I waited for a lull in the conversation, then sigh dramatically. I began talking about how overwhelming everything felt lately, not just the wedding, but thinking about the future. I directed my words to Leo, but my eyes were on Richard and Sophia. I told them I was starting to worry about being a burden as I got older, that managing my own finances and assets felt increasingly complex. I mentioned, with a wave of my hand, that I needed to get my affairs in order, especially concerning the art collection my mother had left me. I told them the paperwork was a nightmare and I could barely keep track of it all. I was dangling the bait, painting myself as a wealthy, aging, and incompetent woman, and they took it. Sophia was the first to slip. She leaned forward, her expression a mask of sincere concern, and started offering incredibly specific advice. She talked about the benefits of establishing a particular type of art trust and the pros and cons of certain international auction houses for appraisal. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, far beyond what a girl who supposedly grew up with nothing could possibly know. It was a tiny tear in her carefully crafted costume of the naive orphan. Leo didn't notice a thing, but Richard did. I saw a flash of panic in his eyes before he quickly composed himself, and then he made the bigger mistake. He jumped in to cover for her, chuckling as he told us he'd been educating Sophia on the art world, wanting her to be prepared for the life she was marrying into. He then put his hand on my arm, his touch feeling proprietary and chilling. He told me not to worry my head about a thing. He said he was so glad Sophia had a good head for these matters, because she would be a wonderful help to Leo in managing everything for me. Down the line. He delivered the line with a warm, reassuring smile. But it was a threat, a promise. He wasn't just covering for her slip-up, he was stating their intention out loud, dressing it up as love and concern. In his arrogance, he was confirming the audio file. He was telling me my future right to my face. They had already replaced me. In their minds, my assets, my legacy, my entire life already belonged to them. I smiled back, a fragile, grateful smile that didn't reach my eyes. I told him that was a lovely thought and that it put my mind at ease. They had bought the performance completely. They left that night confident, believing I was a confused, fading woman who was practically handing them the keys to the kingdom. But as I washed the dishes in the silent kitchen, I wasn't shaking with fear. I was buzzing with a cold, electric clarity. His arrogance, their shared, smug certainty, that was their weakness. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had given me the very weapon I needed to dismantle their entire world. The smug, confident look on Richard's face after that dinner became my North Star. It was the image I held in my mind as I met with Frank the next day. I explained what had happened, how Richard had so casually and arrogantly revealed their hand. Frank agreed that their overconfidence was a weakness, but he cautioned me. The audio recording was powerful, but it could be dismissed in a legal setting as a fantasy, a cruel conversation that they never intended to act on. To truly protect myself and to ensure they faced real consequences, I needed Mari. I needed to know everything. I needed to understand why. Sophia's motive seemed clear enough, a twisted, long-simmering revenge for her father, but Richard's motive felt incomplete. Was it just greed? Was it a midlife crisis of the most monstrous kind? To throw away 30 years, to plot the destruction of his own wife and the mother of his child, just for money, seemed too simple. There had to be something else pushing him, something he was terrified of. I asked Frank to shift his focus again. I wanted him to dig into Richard's current business dealings. I told him to forget the past for a moment and find out what was happening with Richard's supposedly successful firm right now. While Frank dug into Richard's world, I decided it was time to build my own war room. I couldn't do this alone. I called my lawyer, Carol, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I had known for years. She was the only person besides Frank who I could trust. We met in her office, a sterile, quiet space that felt like a sanctuary. I told her everything, from the very beginning. I watched her professional composure crack as I recounted the story, her eyes widening with shock. Then, I played her the audio file. She listened to the entire thing without a word, her expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. When it was over, she took off her glasses and looked at me. She told me we weren't just going to defend against this, we were going to preempt it. For the next hour, we mapped out a silent, invisible financial strategy. She advised me on how to move my personal assets, including the art collection, into a secure trust that Richard couldn't possibly touch, a legal fortress he wouldn't even know existed until it was too late. For the first time, I felt a flicker of power. I wasn't just dodging bullets anymore. I was laying my own traps. The real answer to the why came 2 days later. Frank called and asked me to meet him. The look on his face when I arrived at the diner was grim. He slid a folder across the table, but this one wasn't filled with birth certificates or deeds. It was filled with spreadsheets and financial reports. He told me, in his quiet, methodical way, that Richard's investment firm was a house of cards. My husband, the financial genius, hadn't turned a real profit in over 5 years. He had suffered a series of catastrophic losses in the market and had been covering them up ever since, using new investor money to pay off old ones. It was a classic Ponzi scheme on the verge of collapse. Richard wasn't just solvent. He was millions of dollars in debt and was likely facing SEC investigation and total ruin. I stared at the numbers, and the final, ugly piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't about a passionate affair with Sophia. He wasn't choosing her over me. He was a drowning man, an hisomion, my asesas, a life raft. Sophia hadn't just appeared in our lives by chance. She was his co-conspirator. She had come to him with her revenge plot and, in the process, had told him about my secret, multi-million-dollar art collection. She had handed him the solution to all his problems on a silver platter. Their plan wasn't a partnership of passion. It was a merger of desperation and vengeance. He would help her get revenge, and in return he would get the capital he needed to disappear before his world imploded. All the pieces of our life for the past 5 years, the lavish vacations, the expensive cars, the generous donations at charity balls, was all a performance, a desperate, frantic act to maintain the illusion of success while he sank deeper and deeper into the abyss. He hadn't been looking at me with love. He had been looking at me like a mark. The disgust was a physical thing, a bitter taste at the back of my throat. But underneath it, a new, colder thought took root. He thought my money was his escape hatch. He had no idea I was about to seal it shut and watch him drown. Knowing Richard was financially ruined changed the entire equation. He wasn't a predator circling a kill. He was a starving wolf, and his desperation made him predictable. His entire plan with Sophia hinged on one critical prize: my mother's art collection. They thought it was their secret jackpot. I decided to make it the centerpiece of my hiding it wasn't enough. Defending it wasn't enough. I needed to use it as bait. My lawyer, Carol, had already created the legal fortress to protect my assets. Now I needed an architect for my trap. There was only one person I could trust: Julian Croft. Julian was a legendary art dealer in the city, a man whose reputation was as pristine as the galleries he owned. More importantly, he had been a dear friend of my mother's. He had helped her acquire many of the pieces in the collection and knew their sentimental value to me. I met him in his private office, a quiet, elegant room that smelled of old books and lemon polish. I didn't tell him about the affairs or the plots to have me committed. The story was too ugly, too raw. Instead, I gave him a carefully edited version of the truth. I told him I had discovered severe financial improprieties committed by my husband and that I needed to protect my mother's legacy. I told him I was preparing for a difficult separation and needed to have a powerful, undeniable asset on my side. I watched his kind, intelligent face shift from concern to a quiet, protective anger on my behalf. He had always been fond of my mother, and I could see he felt a duty to protect her memory. He agreed immediately to do a full, confidential appraisal of the collection. But I needed more than that. I needed a favor. I needed an ally to play a part in a piece of theater. A few days later, I staged my next performance for Richard and Sophia. Over dinner, I put on my best resigned and trying to make peace act. I told them I had been doing a lot of thinking. I said that life was too short for bitterness, and all that mattered to me was Leo's happiness. Then, I delivered the bait. I announced that, as a wedding gift, I had decided to sell one of the most valuable paintings from my mother's collection, piece worth nearly $500,000, to give them a generous start in their new life. The reaction was instantaneous. I watched Sophia's eyes widen, a flicker of pure, unadulterated greed passing over her face before she could replace it with practiced gratitude. Richard was even worse. He put his arm around me, telling me he was so touched by my generosity, his voice thick with false emotion. I could practically feel the gears turning in his head as he mentally spent the money, plugging the holes in his sinking financial ship. They were so blinded by the sudden proximity of the prize, they couldn't see the trap it was attached to. Then I delivered the final, crucial detail. I told them that to make it all official and celebratory, my mother's dear friend, the renowned Julian Croft, had insisted on attending the engagement party himself. I explained he would make a special announcement during the toasts and present them with a ceremonial check. Their jaws practically hit the floor. The idea of a man as famous and respected as Julian Croft publicly bestowing such a gift upon them was more than they could have dreamed of. It was the ultimate validation of their new status. It cemented their victory in their minds. I was not just giving them the money. I was handing it to them on a silver platter in front of 200 of our closest friends and colleagues. They couldn't stop thanking me. Richard kept telling me how proud he was of me, how I was finally letting go of the past. Sophia held my hand and told me I was the mother she never had. The words were poison, but their belief in them was my shield. That night, I knew I had them. Julian had agreed to play his part perfectly. Richard and Sophia were walking toward the cliff's edge, utterly convinced they were about to be crowned king and queen. They had no idea they were about to be pushed. With the bait laid and my key players in position, the weeks leading up to the engagement party were a strange, surreal blur. On the surface, I was the model of a supportive mother, attending dress fittings with Sophia and helping Leo finalize the guest list. But beneath the surface, I was a general, meticulously planning a Dita invasion. Every smile was a tactic, every polite question a piece of reconnaissance. I spent my nights in a new kind of war room with Frank Miller. We took every piece of evidence we had gathered and wove it into a single, undeniable narrative of destruction. We had Sophia's real birth certificate, a clear photo of her mother wearing the locket, and the property records showing Richard's Shell Corporation had bought her childhood home. We had the old bank statements showing Richard's financial dealings around the time of Dimitri's death, and the new, damning reports that exposed his current firm as a Ponzi scheme on the brink of collapse. And we had the ace up my sleeve. The crystal-clear audio recording of Richard and Sophia plotting to have me committed. It was a mountain of proof, an avalanche of truth ready to be released. But I knew that how the truth was revealed would be just as important as the truth itself. A hysterical outburst during the party could be dismissed. I needed something cold, factual, and irrefutable. I needed a spectacle. The venue for the party was a beautiful, historic hotel ballroom with high ceilings and classic decor. While reviewing the contract, I saw they offered AV equipment rentals. That's when the final piece of the plan clicked into place. I told the event coordinator I wanted to add a large projector and screen to our package. I explained, with a tear in my eye, that I was preparing a surprise slideshow, a sentimental journey of Leo and Amber's lives to be shown during the toasts. Richard loved the idea, telling me it was a wonderfully personal touch. He had no idea the slideshow wasn't going to be baby pictures. It was going to be their indictment. There was one moment, a week before the party, when my resolve almost shattered. I walked past Leo's room and saw him on the phone with his friends, his voice boyish and full of pure, unadulterated joy, telling them how he couldn't wait for them to meet the woman he was going to spend the rest of his life with. The sound of his happiness was a knife in my gut. To save him, I had to destroy him first. I had to rip his heart out in front of 200 people. The weight of that knowledge was crushing, and for a long, dark moment, I considered calling it all off. But then I remembered his face, so full of trust, and I remembered Sophia's cold voice on that recording, planning to liquidate my assets. I remembered Richard's patronizing hand on my arm, promising me Sophia would take care of my affairs. The pain I was about to cause Leo was a necessary surgery to cut out a cancer. To leave it would be to let it kill him slowly. I hardened my heart and locked the final pieces into place. I met with Carol, my lawyer, and gave her the final timeline. She would have a team ready to file emergency injunctions on all of Richard's known assets the moment she got a text from me. I spoke with Julian Croft, who confirmed he would be there, ready to play his part as a distinguished guest and, ultimately, a witness. My last call was to Frank. He confirmed the slideshow was loaded onto a discreet laptop, ready to go. Then I asked him for one last thing. I told him that with the evidence of multi-million-dollar fraud we had, this wasn't just a family drama anymore. This was a federal crime. As a former FBI agent, he knew exactly what I was asking. He told me he would make a call. He couldn't promise anything, but he said he knew a couple of agents in the white-collar division who would be very interested in attending a party where a major financial criminal was being exposed. They would be nearby, waiting for his signal. The night before the party, I stood in the silent ballroom after a final walkthrough. The tables were set, the flowers were arranged, and a large white screen stood innocently at the front of the room. They were expecting a celebration of their perfect future. They had no idea they were walking into their public execution. And I, the quiet, loving mother of the groom, was going to be the one to swing the axe. The day of the engagement party, I moved through my routine as if in a dream. I had my hair and makeup done, the stylist chattering around me about the beautiful event to come. I slipped into the elegant, deep blue gown Carol had insisted I buy, a dress that felt more like a suit of armor than a piece of formal wear. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman I barely recognized. She was poised, her makeup was flawless, and there wasn't a single hair out of place, but her eyes held the cold, steady calm of a soldier on the morning of a battle. There was no fear left, only purpose. The ballroom was even more beautiful than I remembered, filled with the soft glow of chandeliers and the murmur of 200 guests. The air smelled of expensive perfume and floral arrangements. This was Richard's kingdom, filled with the powerful business associates and society friends he had cultivated for decades. These were the people whose admiration was the very air he breathed. I moved through the crowd, a fixed, serene smile on my face, accepting congratulations and compliments on the stunning party. I was playing the final, most important role of my life, the proud, happy mother. Richard and Sophia were holding court in the center of the room, shining like twin stars of deceit. He was at his most charming, a hand on the back of every important guest, his laughter booming through the room. Sophia was breathtaking in a white dress, playing the part of the modest, grateful fiancée to perfection. She would occasionally catch my eye across the room and give me a small, conspiratorial smile, as if we were partners in this grand success. The arrogance was stunning. They truly believed they had won. The toasts were scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock. At 5 minutes to the hour, as I was mentally rehearsing my opening lines, a hand touched my arm. It was Leo. He pulled me into a quiet alcove, his face a mixture of love and concern. He told me he'd noticed I'd seemed sad and distant for the past few weeks. He said he knew it must be hard for a mother to let go of her only son, but that it meant the world to him that I was trying so hard to make Sophia feel welcome. My heart fractured. Then he delivered the blow I never saw coming. With his eyes shining with sincerity, he told me he wanted me to give the first toast of the evening, not his father, not his best man, but me. He then pushed a small stack of note cards into my hand. He told me he knew I wasn't a fan of public speaking, so he had jotted down a few points for me. I glanced at the top card. In my son's familiar handwriting were the words, "Start by welcoming Amber, the daughter I never had, into our family." The breath caught in my throat. It was the most loving, thoughtful, and unintentionally cruel thing he could have possibly done. In a single, heartfelt gesture, he had nearly derailed my entire plan. I couldn't coldly present an indictment now. He had just handed me a script of love and praise and asked me to perform it. My meticulously planned, evidence-based takedown felt impossible. For a split second, I wanted to confess everything, to pull him close and tell him the truth right there in the alcove. But looking past him, I saw Richard and Sophia watching us, their smiles smug and They saw a touching mother-son moment. They saw their final victory being cemented by the family's matriarch. I had no choice. I had to adapt. I looked at my son, my beautiful, trusting boy, and gave him the most genuine smile I could manage. I told him it was the most wonderful idea he'd ever had, and that I would be honored. I kissed his cheek, turned, and began walking toward the stage. His innocent note cards clutched in my hand like a death sentence. The master of ceremonies was already at the microphone, calling for quiet and introducing the mother of the groom. A spotlight found me. The room fell silent. Leo was looking at me with so much love. He was practically glowing. Richard and Sophia raised their champagne glasses, their faces beaming with triumph. They were expecting a tribute to their future. I was about to deliver its eulogy. I stood at the podium, the warmth of the spotlight feeling like an interrogation lamp. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy blanket of expectation. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me. I saw Leo, my dear son, looking at me with such pride. I saw Richard and Sophia, their champagne glasses held high, their faces radiating smug victory. They were all waiting for a story of love. My hands were surprisingly steady as I looked down at my son's note. I began to speak, my voice starting off soft, colored with the exact shade of maternal emotion they all expected. I read from his first card. I welcomed our cherished friends and family. I spoke of the joy of seeing my son so happy, so in love. I turned to Leo and told him, with all the sincerity I had left in my soul, that he had a good and noble heart and that I was, and always would be, intensely proud of him. A gentle wave of AWS rippled through the audience. Then, I turned my gaze to Sophia. I paused, letting the silence stretch just a little too long. I raised my glass, "And I would like to propose a toast," I said, my voice changing, losing its warmth and gaining a sharp, clear edge of steel, "to the woman my son knows as Amber." I looked directly into her eyes, which were now flickering with confusion. "But that's not her real name, is it?" I placed Leo's note cards neatly on the podium. A confused murmur spread through the room. Richard's smile froze on his face. Behind me, the large white screen flickered to life. It wasn't a picture of Leo as a toddler. It was a handsome, smiling photograph of a man most of the older guests recognized instantly. "Some of you may remember this man," I said, my voice now filling the ballroom, amplified and commanding. His name was Dmitry Petrov. He was my husband's best friend, his partner. 20 years ago, we were told he took his own life after a series of bad investments left him financially ruined. I saw Richard go rigid, the color draining from his face. The screen changed. It was now a high-resolution image of a birth certificate. The name Sofia Elena Petrov was circled in red. The parents' names, Dmitry and Elena, were impossible to miss. "This is his daughter, Sofia," I announced. "The little girl who disappeared after her father's death. The same woman who now stands before you, calling herself Amber." A collective gasp went through the room. Leo took an involuntary step back from Sofia, his face a canvas of disbelief. He looked from the screen to her, his mouth slightly agape, searching for an explanation that wasn't there. But I was just getting started. "The story of Dmitry's ruin was a lie," I continued, as the screen began to cycle through a series of bank statements. I pointed to the highlighted transfers. Millions of dollars moving from Dmitry's accounts into an offshore shell corporation owned by my husband, dated the week before his death. Next came the deed of sale for the Petrov family home, bought at auction for pennies on the dollar by that same secret company. "Richard didn't just watch his friend fall," I said, my voice ringing with cold fury. "He pushed him. He bankrupted him, stole his fortune, and left his family with nothing." The murmuring in the room grew into a roar of shock and disgust. Richard's business partners were staring at him, their faces masks of horror. He started to shout something from his seat, something about lies, that I was hysterical, but his voice was drowned out by the evidence. "And now," I said, my eyes locking on Sofia, whose face was no longer that of a sweet fiancée but a cornered animal, "the story comes full circle. Sofia, rightly wanting revenge on the man who destroyed her father, came back. But her plan wasn't just to expose him, it was to join him." The screen now showed the financial reports from Frank's investigation, charts showing Richard's firm was an insolvent house of cards. My husband, a desperate man, on the verge of his own ruin, saw his salvation. Together, they hatched a new plan. A plan not just to take what was left of Dmitry's money, but to take what was mine. And then I played the audio. Frank, my unassuming AV tech for the evening, hit the key. Their voices, crisp and clear, filled the silent room. The entire party heard them plotting to have me committed for dementia. They heard them discussing the power of attorney. They heard Sofia's cold, dismissive voice talking about liquidating all my assets, including the secret art collection she planned to steal as her bonus. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Leo let out a sound, a choked, guttural cry of pure agony, and he physically recoiled from Sofia, his face utterly broken. The illusion of his life had just been shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. Richard, his face purple with rage, finally lunged forward, trying to get to the stage, screaming that it was all fake, that I was a crazy, vindictive liar. Sofia didn't move. She just stood there, her mask of sweetness completely gone, replaced by a look of pure, incandescent hatred directed at me. The chaos was reaching a fever pitch. Guests were on their feet, shouting, pointing. Richard was being held back by two of his former friends. It was in that perfect moment of pandemonium that the grand ballroom door swung open with a resounding thud. The entire room fell silent. Standing in the doorway was Frank, and he was flanked by two calm, stone-faced federal agents. The party was over. The reckoning had begun. The moment the federal agents stepped into the ballroom, a chilling silence fell over the chaos. The shouting stopped. Every eye was on the doorway. There was no struggle, no dramatic chase, just a quiet, methodical dismantling of a life. I watched from the stage as they approached Richard. All the blustering rage, all the defiant screaming from moments before, evaporated. It was replaced by a pathetic, slack-jawed disbelief. The king of this opulent room was suddenly just a scared, defeated old man in an expensive suit. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. They moved to Sofia next. She didn't look scared. She looked feral. The mask of the sweet, wronged orphan was gone forever, and in its place was a cold, hard fury. As the agents led her away, her eyes found mine. It wasn't a look of remorse or regret. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. The look of a predator who was furious she'd been out. She walked past Leo, who stood frozen, his face a hollow mask of grief. He couldn't even look at her. He just stared into the middle distance, at the ruins of a future that had never been real. In the weeks and months that followed, the legal system did its work. Richard's Ponzi scheme, combined with the overwhelming evidence of the fraud against Dmitry Petrov, earned him a long prison sentence. His empire, built on lies and phantom profits, crumbled into dust, his assets frozen and seized. Facing a host of charges herself, Sophia did the only thing she could. She confessed to everything in exchange for a plea deal, her testimony officially corroborating every single detail I had revealed that night. The war was officially over. But winning a war and living with the peace that follows are two very different things. The grand house that had once been my pride and joy now felt like a mausoleum, every room haunted by the ghosts of 30 years of lies. My greatest challenge wasn't facing Richard in court. It was sitting with my son in the deafening silence of our broken home. Leo was shattered. He had lost his father and the woman he loved in a single, brutal night. For weeks, he barely spoke. We would sit together, sometimes for hours, and I learned that a mother's love isn't always about offering solutions. Sometimes it's just about bearing witness to their pain, about being a steady presence in the wreckage until they can find their own footing. Slowly, day by day, he began to heal. We talked about his father, the good man he remembered from his childhood, and the monster he was revealed to be. We learned to hold both truths at once, however painful. As for me, I had to find myself again. I was no longer Mrs. Richard Sterling, the society wife. I was just Eleanor, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I sold the house. I couldn't build a new life on a foundation of deceit. With the proceeds from the sale, and with the entirety of my mother's art collection, the very prize they had tried to steal, I decided to build something new. I started a foundation. I called it the Petrov Project. In honor of Dmitry, we provide legal aid and financial counseling to victims of complex financial fraud, the very people the system so often leaves behind. It was an act of restorative justice, a way to honor the man Richard had erased and to give a better ending to the story of the family he destroyed. I learned the hard way that the most frightening monsters aren't hiding under the bed. Sometimes they're sleeping in it. But I also learned that the truth, no matter how painful, is a powerful weapon. Richard and Sophia tried to bury me alive, to erase my name and steal my future. They failed. I took the pain and the betrayal, and I forged it into a purpose. The best revenge isn't just surviving. It's using the rubble of the life they destroyed to build a new one, a stronger one, a house built not on lies, but on truth. My name is Eleanor, and for the first time in my life, I am truly, completely, and unapologetically free. Thank you for hearing my story to the very end. Sharing such a painful part of my life isn't easy, but it feels less heavy knowing you were here with me. If you believe stories like this are important and want to hear other tales of justice and survival, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It would also give me great comfort to know where my friends in this journey are. If you're willing, please let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. Your support means more than you know.